It is truly a pleasure to be a part of this lectureship this year. In my judgment, this is one of the better ones. Maybe it's because of all the stuff that's going on in the political world and also with the virus and all that kind of thing. And it's been a real encouragement to me. And I really do appreciate every speaker. And I haven't heard one single lesson that I thought was a bad lesson. And so I really do appreciate that. And we appreciate the 39th Street Church. The 39th Street Church has been involved in our work from, it's too many years, from back in none of your business. And I really don't remember calling Jack about that bulletin article. I think about I don't think that we came to the first lectureship. I think that was the same year that we moved to Kansas City in '82. And I don't think we made it over to that first one. I don't remember that. The second one, I kept hearing these words about 39th Street and different things. And the more I came, I thought, well, these folks are like me, and we got to our relationship built from there, and we really have through the years appreciated the work and to be involved in the work here as well, and to be a part of this lectureship for many years. It has been truly an encouragement through the years, but I think this year, at least for me, has really been a blessing. One of the great prophets of old is Elijah. Now we know he's one of the great prophets because, when Jesus was transfigured on the mountain, who appeared with him? Elijah, along with Moses. So we know he's one of the great prophets. And also because of Matthew chapter 11 and verse 11, Jesus said, there is none greater prophet than John the Baptizer. But then when you look at John the Baptizer, who is he compared to? Elijah. And so we know that Elijah was one of the great prophets. Now, he had his difficulties, there's no doubt about it. But at the same time, he is one of the great prophets of old. And interestingly, Elijah was not a writing prophet. And what do we mean by a writing prophet? Is a prophet who wrote down materials like Isaiah did, or Jeremiah, or Ezekiel, or Daniel, or Hosea, or whoever it might be. We don't know specifically any sermons that Elijah actually delivered. We don't have a record of anything like that. I'm quite confident it would have been a tremendous lesson, but nobody wrote down, and Elijah did not write those things down. If you did not know, the word or the name Elijah and the name Joel are opposites. El, at the beginning of Elijah, means God. It's the singular form of the word Elohim. Elohim is actually plural. El is the singular form of that. And so you have Elijah. The Eli actually means my God or my El, and then the Jah is short for Jehovah. And so the word or the name Elijah simply means God is Jehovah, or Elohim is Jehovah. Joel is the opposite. Jo, at the beginning of Joel, is the term that refers to Jehovah. El is Elohim, or El, the shorter form of it. And so is Jehovah Jehovah is God, or Jehovah is Elohim. Now that's interesting because of something that's going to happen within in this account. Now our purpose is to learn about this, or from this great prophet. For he was a man of God who remained faithful even during difficult times. Now please turn with me to chapter 18 of the book of 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 18. Now there are some things I'm going to put on the screen here, but most of it I'm not going to. I'm just going to give kind of summaries about it. Now, the way I divided the text is that we have the incidents that led up to it, or the background that led up to the question or the statement that Ahab said to Elijah. Now this incident centers around really two different things. You have a famine that took place, and you also have a man named Obadiah. And Obadiah was a good man. Now concerning the famine, notice what James had to say. Now I'm not going to use a lot of cross-references, but I am going to cross-reference this particular thing because it gives us an insight that we don't get from the book of 1 Kings. Now James chapter 5 verses 17 and 18, James used Elijah as an illustration of a prayer of faith. He used Elijah as an illustration of a fervent prayer offered up by a righteous man. And this is what James wrote. Elias, or Elijah, it's the King James or the Greek form, the Koine Greek form of the word Elijah. Elijah, or Elisha, or Elias rather, was a man subject to like passions as we are, and he prayed earnestly that it might not rain. And it rained not on the earth by the space of 3 years and 6 months. And he prayed again, and heaven gave rain, and the earth brought forth her fruit. Now, James gives us the insight that it was 3.5 years between these two events, and that it began with his prayer, and it ended with his prayer. Now, what's interesting in the book of 1 Kings, you never read about the prayer for the famine. You only read about the prayer that ended the famine. But we know that James was inspired. It's not like Luther said it was right. The snide comment that Luther made about James, but James was inspired of God, and so we know that was the truth. Now, the beginning of the famine is recorded when we first learn about Elijah. The first time we learn about Elijah is in 1 Kings chapter 17. Elijah warned Ahab. He said, "And Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, said unto Ahab, As the Lord God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my words." Now, having studied Bible geography, one of the interesting things about Palestine is that Palestine receives the same amount of rain as does London, England. If you didn't know that. Now, that's interesting, but here's the difference between it. Palestine receives rain only 50 days a year, and London, England receives the same amount 300 days a year. Now, that's really kind of amazing. But in other words, when it rains in Palestine, it rains, and it rains hard. But they have to get moisture somewhere, and where the moisture comes from, as far as Palestine is concerned, is the dew from Mount Hermon comes across the land and provides that. Now notice what Elijah said. There not be dew, nor would there be rain for 3 years. 3 years. Now, I don't know about you. I've never seen it not rain for 3 years. Now, I've seen it not rain for 3 months. And you know how dry it gets. And I mean, you start talking about the dirt in the air and those kind of things. And it's amazing how dry it can be. Could you imagine it not raining for 3 years? That's beyond my comprehension. Now, what's interesting about this also is that after Elijah said this, he was taken into, he was fed by ravens. He was down at the brook. He was separated. We don't know how long that was. Then he went and lived with the widow of Zarephath, and during that time he raised the son of the widow of Zarephath up. But that was a period of 3 years. So 1 chapter later, but 3.5, or approximately 3.5 years later, this is what is said. In 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 1, And it came to pass after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, Go show thyself to Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth. So now that's a little bit about the famine. There's the promise that it would not rain, and then the promise that it would rain. Now, it is also interesting that Elijah prayed for this rain. And the text actually doesn't say that he prayed for it not to rain, and here at least it doesn't say anything about him praying for the rain. It does at the end of the chapter, and we'll look at that here in a little bit. But Elijah stands as that example of the prayer of faith. And though the age of miracles have ended, we must never underestimate the power of prayer. Well, before it rained, and as Elijah predicted, these events then had to take place. Now, the other person in this account, besides Ahab and also Elijah, is a man named Obadiah. And Obadiah is a very interesting man as well. Now, most likely, it is not, and I think we could say it even more definite to that it's not the Obadiah of the book of Obadiah. If you didn't know it, there's 13 different Obadiahs in the Old Testament. 13 of them. So I don't know about you, that kind of gets a little bit confusing when you read this particular name, but nonetheless, we must recognize that. And it's not the same Obadiah that wrote the book. But this Obadiah, like the one who wrote the book, was a man who feared the Lord greatly. That's what he says, and that's the comment that's said about him in verse number 3. And in fact, he was a man that was able to preserve 100 prophets of the Lord. Now, he did it in groups of 50, and he provided food for them, bread and water, and provided them an escape from Jezebel. Now, you remember who Jezebel was. Jezebel was Ahab's wife. In other words, she was the queen of Israel. And she was probably, well, no, not probably. She was more wicked than Ahab. Now, Jeroboam introduced idolatry to the northern kingdom of Israel. No doubt about it. Ahab introduced to Israel Baal worship or Balaam worship. But it really wasn't introduced by Ahab, even though we attribute it to him. It was really Jezebel that introduced it. Now, neither Jezebel or Ahab were good people. They were not good people. They were the kind of people that, well, killing someone or murdering someone was not above them. You remember when, not long after Ahab became a king, he wanted Naboth's vineyard. And he's kind of like a spoiled child. You know, he cried about it and all that kind of stuff and moaned about it and all that. And Jezebel said, "You're king of Israel, why don't you just go kill him?" Wasn't that? And that's what he did. I mean, that's the kind of people that we're talking about. Now, Obadiah, he is a servant of Ahab. And he then puts his life on the line by preserving these 100 prophets from the judgment of Jezebel and the death that Jezebel would bring upon them. And he did it, as I said, in groups of 50. And he hid them in a cave and provided food for them. Well, because of the famine that was going on, now that by this time, it's over 3 years long. And they're running out of water. They're running out of something to drink. And so Ahab sends Obadiah one direction, and Ahab goes the other way. Well, Obadiah's out looking for water for cattle and for probably even for themselves, but nonetheless, he's out looking for that. And Elijah meets up with him. And Elijah instructs Obadiah, "You go tell Ahab that I'm going to be here." Now, Obadiah, I've always been humored by this. So Obadiah, he says, "Wait a minute here. I mean, what have I done? I mean, have I sinned? I mean, you're wishing a death wish on me because when I go tell Ahab and he comes down here, you're going to be gone. And he's going to slay me. Well, Elijah, he then reassured him that he would be there. And sure enough, so when Ahab comes down, Ahab and Elijah meet up. Now here are the words then. Whoops, I'm sorry. I'm getting behind on my PowerPoint. Forgot that I had it, I guess. Anyway, so here's what Ahab said to Elijah. And it came to pass when Ahab saw Elijah that Ahab said unto him, Art thou he that troubleth Israel? And he answered, I have not troubled Israel, but thou and thy father's house, in that ye have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and thou hast followed Balaam. Now notice the difference between what Ahab said and what Obadiah said. Now remember, Obadiah's out looking for water. Elijah came to see him, and here's what Obadiah said. Art thou that my Lord Elijah? Obadiah showed great respect to Elijah. But on the other hand, this is what Ahab said. Art thou he that troubleth Israel? Whole lot of difference there. Obadiah showed great respect and even fear of God. But Ahab showed absolutely no respect for the prophet of God. With boldness then, Elijah answered Obadiah. Now remember, Ahab was the king of Israel. He had little moral character, and murder was not above him. I mean, it didn't make him any difference at all. And in addition, remember, Elijah came to bless Israel with rain, but Ahab cursed him. So the real troubler were Ahab and the people who forsook the commandments of God, the commandments of the Lord, and followed after Balaam. That's verse 18. Now, we need to spend a little bit of time with this concept of who Balaam is. Now, Balaam, that's actually the plural form of the word Baal. And Balaam were the gods and the goddesses of the Phoenicians and the Canaanites. And Balaam is normally associated with fertility. But don't think about it in the sense of human fertility. Now, that was included in this, but usually that's the way we think about fertility gods. We think about them as with reference to human fertility, and oftentimes the pagan gods were different connections with fertility of different ways. But fertility is used in the sense of the production of different things like corn and wheat and grape juice and so forth and so on. It's the production of crops and fruits and also livestock. Baal himself, now I'm not talking about Balaam, but I'm talking about the head god, Baal. He was sometimes called the storm god or the god of storms. And there are artifacts that we have that are connected with Balaam. And I saw one statue in one place where his arm is up. Now, it wasn't anything in his hands because it probably was made out of something that deteriorated. But normally he was pictured with a lightning bolt in his hand. God of storms. Now, you keep that in mind as we go through this account. Here it is, the God of storm. And he is then with that lightning bolt in his hand, and he would then send down the lightning bolt, which would bring about the rain, which would bring about the crops, which would bring about the fruits of the land, which would provide the nourishment for the livestock and the grass for the livestock to eat. And the rain then brought produce and brought all the things that it did. Now notice this. The real troublers are those, Elijah said, who forsook the right ways of the Lord and followed the false ways of the false gods. Now that's who Elijah said. And he was very direct with the king, Ahab. Now we get to the challenge. And that's found in verses 19 to 40. And there needed to be a choice that was made. Was Elijah the troubler of Israel, or were the followers of Balaam the troublers of Israel? Now we already know the answer to that. Elijah made it clear which ones were really the troublers of Israel. But the answer to this question answers another important question. Which is it? Is Balaam God or is Jehovah God? Now with the challenge, there had to be a decision made. And for the prophets of Baal met Elijah on Mount Carmel with all Israel as witnesses. And now in verse 19 it says, whoops, hit the wrong button there. I guess I hit it more than once. So a decision needed to be made. In verse 19, now therefore send and gather to me all Israel into Mount Carmel, and the prophets of Baal 450, and the prophets of the groves 400, which ate at Jezebel's table, along with the challenge of the decision. Verse 21, and Elijah came unto all the people and said, how long halt ye between two opinions? If the Lord, if Jehovah be God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. Now notice what it says, the comment. And the people answered him not a word. You ever been in a situation like that? Decision needs to be made. And you point out, here's the obvious. And the students sit there like lumps on a log and say nothing. Brandon. It happened more than once. But I've also been in congregations where similar things have taken place. And you give a choice, and they answer not a word. Now, they should have known who was the real God. I mean, isn't it God that led them out of Egypt? Isn't it God that led them through the wilderness? Isn't it God that gave them the victories that they had over the various cities as they took the land of Israel? Isn't it God that had blessed them even in light of them requesting the king? Isn't it God that blessed them with the reign of David and with Solomon? And isn't it God that continued to bless them all through the history of Israel? They should have known who was God, but they answered not a word. Quiet. Well, in verses 22 to 24, the terms of the challenge then are made. Elijah basically gave three terms. The first, they were to choose a bull, and the prophets of Baal then actually got two bulls, and they chose the one that they wanted to use. They were to prepare it for a sacrifice, and that included then preparing the bull himself by cutting them up and putting them on some wood and preparing the wood for that. And then the third thing in the challenge was put no fire under it. Well, the challenge was accepted. And the prophets of Baal then went first, which is verses 25 through 29. But keep in mind, the image of Baal that we've already pointed out was a man with a lightning bolt in his hand. And really what Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal to do is, you call upon your God with his lightning bolt, and you have him send fire, lightning bolt, send fire from above and consume that sacrifice. Now that's what Elijah's challenge was. So what did they do? They called upon the name of Baal. And they continue to call upon the name of the Baal. And in fact, it says that it started in the morning and it ended in the evening. Now I don't know. That's around 6 to 8 hours they were calling upon Baal. And during that time, they began to leap about the altar. And I don't know what the full picture of this is, but in my mind, this is the way I picture it. You ever seen a bunch of holy rollers and what they do? That's probably pretty similar to what was taking place right here around this altar. And then they also cut themselves. Now Elijah, he taunted them a little bit during this time. And it is interesting that he did this. It's also interesting, I use some of the same arguments concerning guardian angels. Well, where was your guardian angel when you had your accident? Was he on vacation? Was he sick that day? Was he just out of the country? Or was he asleep? Or where was he? Well, that's what Elijah was saying to the prophets of Baal. Where's Baal? I mean, after all, you picture him with a lightning bolt. He has control of the storms. Here he is. He could send his lightning bolt down. But is he asleep? Where is he? Well, needless to say, Baal is no God at all, and it was to no answer, no avail. Now, the second part of it is Elijah. And Elijah's part is found in verses 30 to 38. And it is interesting as we look at this, that Elijah, the first thing he does is actually calls all the people to come near. Now, where were the people? He'd already called them to Mount Carmel. But, after you've waited for 6 to 8 hours for Baal to do what Baal was supposed to do anyway, and you've waited all that time for Baal, I'm sure there were few stragglers that went here and few stragglers that went there. And so Elijah called them all together. And then Elijah, after that, he repaired the altar of the Lord. Now, I don't know all that much about where the altar was on Mount Carmel. I do know where Mount Carmel is. If you can picture in your mind a map of Palestine, you come up the coastline, the Mediterranean Sea, and there's kind of a little bump out right there, and it comes back in and goes on up. And that little bump out is Mount Carmel. Below it was the plain of Sharon. Above it was the Phoenician plain. Below the plain of Sharon was the plain of Philistia. And so it is there on Mount Carmel that Elijah's there. And there must have been an altar on Mount Carmel. And he repairs that altar. He also gathered the stones that were about it. And he picked out 12 stones, and each of them represented the 12 tribes of Israel. Then it says that he called upon them to dig a ditch. And it actually tells us a little bit about that ditch, and that is that it holds 2 selah of grain. Now, how much is a selah? Well, I've read different things, but it would be somewhere around about 7 to 11 gallons of fluid per selah. So we're talking about somewhere around about, or not gallons, but quarts. And so we're talking about somewhere around 5 gallons of fluid. So it's not a big trench, but you just keep in mind that here it is, these barrels of water. Now these barrels would be more like a pitcher, but nonetheless, they poured that water on that sacrifice, on that wood, plenty of water to soak the sacrifice, plenty of water to soak up the wood and to fill up the water. Now here's what you need to keep in mind though. Have you ever watered dry ground? Remember, the ground had been dry for 3.5 years. It had to be enough water for the ground to soak up what water it would soak up, as well as to fill up the trench around it. And so what happened then? Well, Elijah called upon God. He didn't have to call at 9 o'clock and wait till 10 o'clock, or 10 o'clock and wait till 11 o'clock, or 11 o'clock and wait till 3 o'clock, or 3 o'clock and wait to the evening sacrifice. No, it was immediately. And he called upon God. Look at verse 38. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering or burnt sacrifice, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. Now, you're talking about an amazing sight. I mean, wouldn't you like to have been there? I mean, to me, I get this picture of like a big explosion, and the lightning comes down, and whoosh, and nothing else is left. The power of God is demonstrated, but the desired result came as well. The decision was made, and Israel worshiped God. There's the key right there. There's the key of everything that we do. There's the key that everything we should labor for, that God is worshiped. And the text says, the Lord. Okay, get it here. The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. Now, the word Lord is the word Jehovah, and the word God is the word Elohim. And so, Jehovah, He is Elohim. Jehovah, He is Elohim. And so it accomplished the very purpose that Elijah desired. Now Elijah instructed the people then to gather the prophets of Baal, all the prophets of Baal. And because he says the prophets of Baal, I don't know if it was just the 450 or was included the prophets of the grove. I always have thought it probably included the prophets of the grove, but he doesn't mention that. He only mentions the prophets of Baal. They were to be brought down to Kishon, and which was on the northeast side of Mount Carmel. And Elijah executed them there. Now keep in mind, according to the law of Moses, their crime and their revolt was against God and was punishable by death. Deuteronomy chapter 13. Well, apparently, Ahab, because of the statement made to him by Elijah, Ahab must have been among the people. And he saw Elijah executed them. Because Elijah instructed Ahab, he said, "Get thee up." Look at verse 41. "Get thee up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of abundance of rain." Now the last part of our study is found in the latter part of chapter 18, verses 41 through 46, and this is the rain. And again, Elijah instructed Ahab to eat and to drink. He needed some strength. He must have been among the prophets of Baal, watched the prophets of Baal, probably fasted during that time, and he needed some strength in order to beat the storm back to Jezreel. Now, why? He said, there is the sound of abundance of rain. Elijah could hear it. But now, it hasn't been prayed for yet. And there are things that are yet to be accomplished before that happens. But Elijah said there's an abundance of rain coming and you need to be strengthened because of that. Remember, because of what James wrote, Elijah prayed that it might not rain, and it didn't rain for 3.5 years. And then Elijah prayed, and it rained after that. So as James wrote, this is a 3.5-year period since we saw it back over in 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 1. Now, Elijah returned to Mount Carmel then. He's at the bottom of Mount Carmel, at the brook there where he slew the prophets of Baal, and he goes back up, and he turned to Ahab, and he said, it says that he put his face between his legs, or between his knees, and he prayed. Now that's probably an indication, and I don't believe in postures as far as prayers are concerned, but there are different postures that we have within Scripture. But this is probably indication of how fervent he was praying. He wasn't going to just simply beseech God. He fervently prayed to God. And God, remember, God said, I will send rain. That's chapter 18 and verse 1. However, Elijah needed to request it. Now, sometimes we think to ourselves, well, I don't need to pray to God. After all, God knows my needs. After all, God is aware of all that goes on in my life. I mean, God is omniscient. But Elijah needed to pray. And Elijah understood he needed to make the request. And so he sent his servant to the edge of Mount Carmel to look to see if rain had come. The first time it didn't come. And he went back and told Elijah. And so he prayed again. And he sent the servant. And 7 times he sent the servant. And there was a small cloud that appeared, the size of a hand. I mean, you're talking about a small cloud. And Elijah knew that God had and was going to send that rain from the Mediterranean Sea upon them. Well, as the storm brews then, catch up here again. As the storm brewed, Elijah sent Ahab to his house in Jezreel. Now, I've always found it interesting. Elijah needed to escape the storm just like Ahab needed to. I mean, both of them needed to get away. And you would have thought that Elijah, or rather Ahab, would have said to Elijah, jump in the chariot. I know who the true God is. I know who the true prophet is. You jump in the chariot and go with me to Jezreel. Well, both needed to escape the storm. And Elijah instructed Ahab to get into his chariot and don't stop. He says that the rain stop thee not. In other words, when it comes a little bit of a shower, don't stop. You just keep going because the rain's coming. The real storm is coming. Well, they both needed to escape the storm, and Ahab did as he was instructed, but he did not offer Elijah a ride. Instead, God gave strength to Elijah, and he arrived at the gate of Jezreel before the king. Now, you don't read this in the Scriptures, but if you'll take a map and you measure it, that's approximately 25 miles. So that day, Elijah ran 25 miles faster than Ahab rode in his chariot. 25 miles. That's amazing to me. I couldn't run nearly that much, not even close. Well, the rain did come, and the troubler of Israel then was known. Now remember, there was a choice. Who was the troubler of Israel? Was Elijah the troubler of Israel? And if he wasn't the troubler of Israel, then was the prophets of Baal, those who followed Baal, were they the troublers of Israel? Now God revealed the answer. There's no doubt about that. He revealed who the real troublers were. And by revealing who the real troublers were, He also revealed who the real God is. The real God is Jehovah, not Baal. Those who departed from the truth and led others away were the real troublers. Now, any person who preaches or teaches or stands for the truth in any way is going to be accused of being troublemakers. That goes without saying. And I really thought about the number of different battle scars that I've heard over the years, that I've gone through and different ones have gone through. And I thought, boy, I could just fill up the whole 40 minutes with just talking about those things. But I'm not sure that would benefit us. But I know that the account concerning Elijah does benefit. And we learn the principle that the real troublers of spiritual Israel are not those that teach the truth. It's not the man that stands in the pulpit or stands in the classroom, or the woman that teaches to the children or other ladies that teaches the truth. The real troublers of spiritual Israel are those that teach error and that bring in error. And so we too have a choice. And far too many, and I think over the years, the number of people, and I was thinking the other day of the number of people that I remember in the different places where different ones have said through the years. But how many speakers have we had through the years that have given up and quit? You know, you can say what you want to about Elijah, but he wasn't a quitter. He may have been discouraged, no doubt that he was, and we all get discouraged at different times, but he did not quit. We have a choice. And I'm not talking about a choice to obey the gospel or not to obey the gospel. I'm talking about a choice to stand up for the truth and remain standing for the truth. Not to give in. Don't let Satan win. No, we need to be like Joshua. We need to be the kind of person that can say, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord.